phenotypes, and you cannot make a limit of blank for each and every one of those phenotypes that your assay can detect. So what do we do? Well, we consider that the core typical phenotype is the one that we definitely have to do. And so we do that, and that gives us a good understanding of what that assay is capable to do for this very typical phenotype. But we also acknowledge that when we look for residual disease in a patient with a slightly different phenotype, we need to maybe not say this assay has a sensitivity of 0.01. We need to acknowledge that for this phenotype, maybe we can't be 100% sure what the LOD actually is. So that's how we deal with it, but I'm very grateful for your thoughts on the subject as well. Yeah, this slide is just an example for how we collated data. So in the interest of time, I might move to the next slide. Because the next thing up is, of course, the limit of detection and the lower limit of quantification. And it's quite straightforward. The limit of detection is based on the limit of blank, and then you add this factor, 1.645, times the standard deviation of a sample with a low concentration of analyte. And the limit of quantification can read a little bit differently depending on you read very pure statistics paper like Armbruster and Pry. They've got one definition of this. In the H62, the definition is similar, but they say that you have to put it to the test, okay? So in the H62, the limit of quantification means that you have to spike a sample and actually test your limit of quantification. So to my mind, the H62 treats the LOQ very similar to LOD in some ways. Again, these are not difficult to do. It means you need to spike a sample, run it several times, spike a few samples and run them several times. It just takes time. I do like linearity for some assays, especially the MRD assay, and I think it is related to the lower limit of quantification. I've already mentioned spiked sample, and I think we'll always have to work from a mock sample. Why? Well, for the plasma cell assay, if you want to have a limit of quantification really super low, then you need to use a high volume to get enough total event to reach the sensitivity, right? So we have to create a mock sample, we have to use spike samples. And if we're going to create a mock sample, this is where linearity comes in as well. So we're creating a mock sample and we dilute it into the negative sample so that we get a linearity curve. And once we've done that, we can see which dilution will really be the best one to use for replicates to support our limit of quantification data. Okay? And there's more information on this slide for things to think about when you create mock samples. And I would say that the most important thing here is to make sure, it might sound obvious, but I have seen an example where people use peripheral blood as a sort of dilutant for acute myeloid leukemia, MRD. And I think that's not a good idea. So if you want to create a limit of detection for plasma cells or MRD, like AML or ALL MRD, you really need to use a negative bone marrow as your dilution sample, your dilutant sample. Okay. Here is just a simple example of linearity curves from the P&H assay, and I do like them. It gives you a pretty good idea for the detection level. The H do like to have 5 replicates for this, like I said, so we try to do that when we can. My feeling here is that even if H62 says do 3, do 5, if I do just 1 or 2, then I'll put that in my validation documentation. And then if at a later point I have a chance to do another 1 or 2, fine, but at least I have something. Yes, this is pretty much what I said. I'm jumping ahead. So just to repeat then, that H62 often wants several replicates, which can take a lot of time and can be difficult to find time to do. But we try to do it if we can. Yes. I think this is just a repetition of what so we can move on. So precision. Again, we try to make use of the assays we already have done. So precision, we have a few different types of precision. We have precision between samples set up by different people. We have precision between people who have analysed the sample, the data, and we have precision between different cytometers, which we call parity. And quite often we can have one sample, like here for example, we have one sample and maybe it was set up by, let's say, one person and then later on set up by another person. And then they ran through the sample 3 times and maybe 2 different people analysed each individually. And then the next day or the day after, another person set it up and another person set it up. You run it on 2 different cytometers, 3 times per sample with different people analysing it. So all of a sudden you've got a lot of data points. You even have sample stability if you set up the same sample on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, for example. So you can fill out a lot of the required validation entries in a single mega experiment if it's just very carefully planned. And so this is where we try to pre-plan our experiments as much as possible. And if we know that we have to have 5 negative and 5 low positive samples, we try to create 10 pieces of paper where it says exactly what to do, so we can just do that over the next couple of months or something. Here is an example. So we had, this is how the data has been pooled. So we have staff A, where's my pointer there? Staff A set up the sample in the morning, and staff B set up the sample in the afternoon. And they both set up the sample in triplicate. Okay? And then there's the next day, they set it up in the AM and PM, and again in triplicate. And then for each and every one of this is just one analyst's entry. This was for the plasma cell, so we take the total number of events acquired, singlet number of events acquired, total plasma cells, clonal plasma cell event count, and then we looked at the individual phenotype, how many CD19 positive plasma cells, and so on. And here I seem to have honed in on a particular population, which I assume was a neoplastic population. I can't actually remember now, this was a few years ago. So here was the total plasma cell percentage of the sample, and how many of those were clonal And so that's that result, and that's the clonal plasma cell percent of all viable cells in the sample. And then we take the average, the standard deviation, and we can see the CV. And I can see here that one of the CVs is actually over 20. And if you recall, we ideally, for low numbers, want to have a CV of at or below 20. So these are definitely higher than 10, except for that one, but at least usually below 20. Analyte stability. Well, both of the native sample and also of processed sample. And just like I said about the gating strategy before, that I find that of all things that can go wrong at the end of the day, when we have different results, it's usually the analysis side of it, the gating strategy. But the other thing that I find is the second most common issue is really that the sample might have been 3 days old. For example, I think in the past, often we've taken for granted that so long as we keep it in the fridge or something, it'll probably be okay at 2 or 3 days old, and it is normally. I think you can diagnose CLL on a sample that's even up to sometimes 4 or 5 years old if it's a very, very typical one. But for example, with a TRBC1 antibody, the JOD1 antibody, I find that already after 2.5, 3 days, the separation is not very good. So there I really prefer to do the assay within 48 hours. So the stability of my blood and bone marrow over time is something that I really like to have good knowledge about. And of course, we have to have an assay and a method that fits in with what we do, because we don't work on a weekend, so we need to understand what samples do we prioritize on a Friday to make sure the data is safe. In our hands, when it comes to process stability, we're lucky because we're usually able to acquire the sample immediately after we've processed it. But of course, if one isn't, then it's important to be able to look at the stability of processed samples as well. So here's an example. This is from the monocytosis assay. And the first 2 rows here is from a sample that was set up on the same day that we received it. It was the same day it was taken from the patient. And it looks to me like we have a reactive monocytosis here. Okay. We have evaluated this, and they are better stored in the fridge, we have found. So we've retested the analyte stability with all the samples stored in the fridge, and here is an over 48 hours old sample, the same one as this one. And so 48 hours later, it looks like this, and we have a virtually very similar percentage. So here I seem to have put in some arrows, to highlight the areas where previously I saw a shift, and I think when we store the samples in the fridge now, we don't so much have that problem. We can see here also, I think these might potentially be a difference here between the 2-day-old and the fresh sample. I don't know if that's on background. Sorry about that. This is embarrassing because I can't recall what these arrows show. I'll have to look carefully. I think what happens here is that these are the CD16 positive non-classical monocytes that are found there, whereas after a little bit of time they're less clear and then lower their sides scatter a little bit. That's the main finding there. But we can still pick them up, and at the end of the day, it might be slightly suboptimal, but this readout is the same. So the validation template I've shown you here, it's actually included in this publication in clinical cytometry. Catalina was also part of this work. So you can see it published there for the Cesare assay. And I can only conclude to say thank you very much for listening to this. And these are the guys in my lab. That's Mark, that's Natasha, that's Cherie. And they've worked hard with validation and everything else. And here is Andy, Yuri, and Andrea, and Fiona, who all have worked very much in various contexts on validation with me at different times. I also want to say thank you to somebody called Dan Payne here in the UK, and there's a UCAS, our accreditation body in the UK, called Anselm, and you also have had very useful conversations with. So thank you very much, and
Thank you, Rita. You have given us a fantastic talk. I wonder if we can cope with all that, and how soon?
Yes. Shall I stop sharing, or I'll stop sharing. So yeah, no, it's. I think one just has to do one assay at a time. Really, it's too much work otherwise. It's difficult.
Ulrich, we have 5 minutes. So we can have a couple of questions?
Absolutely, yeah, that's fine.
So my question was, when you validated the monocytosis of the plasma cell assay, you said that this was just for the samples of peripheral blood. But if you use bone marrow